Hey, what's up everyone? So this is Alex here, coming back with the 90-second opening that I'd like to share with you, which is the Rocket opening. So this is a short sequence opening, and it's a very counterintuitive one to play as black, but at the same time there's a lot of surprise factor because almost nobody plays this opening against a diagonal white opponent. So the sequence here is f5, and then with your opponent as white playing f6, and you jump into e6, which is the typical lead up to any diagonal opening. I guess most of them will play to this sequence. And over here, essentially we're exploring a different branch of openings, and this is C7, which is the rocket opening. So why is it named the rocket? If you kind of like take this as the base, this three disc as the base, and this two flanks of white disc as the flanks or the wings, you can see that this is kind of looking like a rocket ship that is blasting off to the lower left corner of the screen or lower left of the board. So yeah, this is called Rocket. And of course, the typical follow-up, which would also be the next opening that I'll be talking about, which is the 93rd opening. It's the F4 response being the best move for white to kind of regroup, and that's essentially called the lollipop opening because it forms a lollipop. But we'll probably go into the white's perspective in the next episode. So in this episode, let's just talk about black's perspective. So the reason why you want to play c7 as potentially a variation, it's to just make it very counterintuitive for your opponent, potentially because your opponent may not be used to responding to this opening. I think most white diagonal players will know that f4 is the best move. Sometimes they do play c6, so I would say f4 is the most common response, followed by c6. So the counterintuitive part may probably come towards the later part, and at the same time, you're giving a lot of advantage to your opponent for the sake of a variation. So I would say that you definitely need to have at least like an advanced player level kind of basic skills in order to try to gain back that advantage here. So I actually play this opening sometimes during blitz, just to throw my opponent off guard. And considering that it's blitz, there's a higher chance of your opponent making mistakes. So let's just follow up from black's perspective. If white were to play f4, that's a typical response. So you do have a few options that almost seem equal, like for example g5, c5, maybe even c3, e3, e7. So one of the reasons why white has to respond this way is due to the checkerboard factor. So typically, I would say that the best response potentially here is to play c5. Of course, you can explore the g5 response as well. I would say c5 is better because the move is more within the center group of the 16 discs, perhaps makes it more compact. Yeah, if you play g5, your 5 discs are kind of like in a flank shape rather than a compact shape, so this could be the case. So over here, I would say it's fairly counterintuitive for white to know that d7 is the best move, because potentially white could also think that, hey, I wanted to keep it within the center 16 and consider c4 and c6 correspondingly. So I would say that if white doesn't know the best move is d7, potentially white could probably play either c4 or c6. And if white were to play c4, you can just jump into the center by flipping these two discs, controlling this mini diagonal, and assuming if white wanted to play c3, you can always cut back. And if white jumps in to control this mini black diagonal, you can easily play either b4 or b6 to just form like a central. So you kind of feed your opponent, and you can potentially just cut into the center either on c3 or d7. So if we were to kind of consider that, it's not too bad. So if white were to play c6 over here, then it's probably slightly more challenging to kind of decide to play e3 because e3 flips two discs in two different directions. But one of the reasons why you need to do that is because you need to establish the d4 disc in order to cut back into the center to d7. So this tends to open up counterintuitive sequences for your opponent. So your opponent may not, think of playing a dispersive move like b4 because simply it's just like a wide spread out shape that allows black to just cut into the center, but rather, maybe potentially white would consider c3 or f3 if they didn't know the book. So I would say this is one of the reasons why this opening could be useful for you, especially against a player who, maybe books a lot, prepares the common book lines quite a bit, so it's a fair variation to have. And of course, if your opponent does know the best move over here, again, you can still choose to play e3, which flips to this in two different directions. I'm not too sure about g5 and c3 follow-up plays out, but I would say that e3 is something that is still playable at this point in time. So assuming white chooses to respond to f3, which is potentially natural, or any of the checkerboard moves. So checkerboard either in c4 or d3 that controls this mini diagonal. So either way is fine, but you can just then select the other move that is still within the center 16, even though it flips this in two different directions. You feed off white center, you can still chip off to the side, and it's still playable. It's still within a playable range to be considered. And of course, if white plays here, you can play still c3, maintaining it to the center. If white jumps in, you can still chip off to the side. If white doesn't go in, you can then just keep your side or cut to the center. So either one works. So if white goes for this move, you can do the same kind of cut across, two-disc cut across that we did earlier in this side of the board. So yeah, I would say that the rocket opening is something that would potentially throw your opponent off if they're playing diagonal and you know that they have a very limited book knowledge. It might be worth giving it a risk. I would say maybe not against Japanese players because the Japanese players almost study everything, but yeah, I'll leave that to you to decide then. Thanks very much for joining me, and let's go into the white's perspective for this opening in the next episode. See you in the next one. Goodbye.